In Mrs Dalloway, we can see how Woolf's depiction of British society, mental illness, dreams and memories, marriage and relationships, and mortality reflect aspects of the world as it was when she wrote the novel. For now, let's get acquainted with this fascinating composer. Virginia Woolf was born Adeline Virginia Stephen on the 25th of January 1882 into a family that valued intellectual and artistic pursuits. Her father was Leslie Stephen, a prominent Victorian editor and historian. Her mother, Julia, was admired and sketched by famous artists. As one of 4 children, Woolf and her sister Vanessa were instructed at home, whereas her brothers, Adrian and Toby, went to school and university. Woolf considered this unequal treatment deeply unfair, as it devalued women's intellectual development. As a founding member of the Bloomsbury Group, Woolf is regarded as one of the most influential writers of her time. Founded in 1912, the Bloomsbury Group were a significant community of English writers, intellectuals, philosophers and artists. In other words, they were the cool kids of London. That same year, she married political theorist and author Leonard Woolf, who encouraged her to write. Together they opened the Hogarth Press in 1917, publishing important authors of their time, such as T.S. Eliot, Catherine Mansfield, and Woolf's own novels. Being a writer and a publisher meant that Woolf was one of the real influences of her time. Her talent and position gave her opportunities to shape perceptions of British society, class and culture. Let's look at how she explores this theme in Mrs Dalloway. A defining feature of Britain has been its rigid class structure. The upper classes own much of the land and therefore control most of the politics. In Mrs Dalloway, we can see how Clarissa owes her privileged status to her wealthy family background and marriage to Richard Dalloway, a conservative politician. But even within the upper class, there are different levels of status and prestige. We see this with Lady Millicent Bruton, who, it is rumoured, has significant influence over the ruling elite. On the other end of the spectrum is Miss Doris Kilman, who is described as poor, single and over 40. Not an ideal situation in 1920s England. She despises Clarissa and considers the upper class the most worthless of all classes, the rich with a smattering of culture. Woolf also wrote in a time of transition for the British Empire. Mrs Dalloway was published 7 years after the end of World War I, a devastating, cruel war which continued to haunt the national psyche. The war also exposed Britain's waning influence on a global scale and the terrible human cost of upholding Britain's status as a superpower. However, Woolf was careful to show that Britain's relationship with their cultural identity was complicated. In the novel, Peter Walsh left England to make a life for himself in India, but when he returns, he sits in Regent's Park and feels very proud that he can claim London as part of his heritage. In addition to rattling British cultural pride, the Great War also exposed harmful attitudes towards mental illness. Apparently, Woolf herself had what we now call bipolar disorder. Her condition caused her to suffer from bouts of depression and mania from an early age. By the time Mrs Dalloway was published in 1925, Woolf had already attempted suicide twice. In the end, her manic and depressive episodes became unbearable for her. In March 1941, sensing that she was on the brink of another serious breakdown, Woolf wrote a note to her beloved Leonard, saying how she couldn't face it. She then filled her pockets with stones and drowned herself in the River Ouse near their Sussex home. Through the character of Septimus Warren Smith in Mrs Dalloway, Woolf exposes how pompous British doctors often failed to help people who suffered with mental illness. In fact, they often made things much worse for their patients. In 1920s Britain, mainstream attitudes held that mental illness could be overcome by willpower. Failure to recover was therefore taken as a sign of weakness or cowardice. In the novel, Septimus suffers from shell shock or post-traumatic stress disorder. Sir William Bradshaw, Septimus's psychiatrist, requires Septimus to be shut away in a rest cure, which was a common treatment for nervous disorders. It entails a prolonged stay in a purpose-built home, often in an isolated rural area, with minimal mental stimulation or contact with loved ones. This onerous prescription distresses Septimus greatly, even to the point of suicide. Thus, Septimus's suicide can be understood as Woolf's critique of bullish specialists who impose their wills on vulnerable patients. For Woolf, seclusion in a rest cure was a fate worse than death. This was made clear through Woolf's own death as, in the days before her suicide, she'd begged her doctor not to shut her away. Woolf also explores dreams, memories, and the passage of time to illustrate the complexity of the human psyche. The seemingly unstructured flow of Mrs Dalloway reflects the way human thoughts meander and is typical of the modernist stream of consciousness style. By recording her characters' thoughts in a continuous flow, Woolf found a distinctive way to represent the surreal nature of human consciousness. In the 1920s, Modernism was a new artistic movement that celebrated experimentation. This resulted in new ways of telling stories, including non-linear plot lines and narration that delves deeply into characters' private thoughts and memories. This style allowed Woolf to manipulate the way she depicts time in the novel. Throughout Mrs Dalloway, Woolf weaves the past and present together, allowing characters' memories to invade their train of thought. For Clarissa, the love triangle that existed between her, Peter, and Richard is a defining memory. Should she have chosen Peter, who embodies her impulsive side? Or was she right to choose Richard, who reflects the conservative ideals of dignity and restraint? It's clear that memories of Bourton are powerful for all key characters in Mrs Dalloway. Back then, they were all on the verge of making major life decisions. Woolf frequently dips back into these memories to depict how our choices can profoundly affect us decades later. What's more, Woolf's exploration of dreams adds depth and complexity to her characters. When Peter nods off in Regent's Park, we are taken on a lengthy psychedelic journey inside his dream as a solitary traveller. By witnessing Peter's dream, Woolf's audience can appreciate his multi-dimensionality and rich inner world. The dream also emphasises the tragedy of Peter Walsh. He's an imaginative and intense man, but chronically lonely and filled with self-doubt. Speaking of doubt, Woolf's portrayal of marriage and relationships illustrates how, in her context, love was often not enough. Historically, marriages in Britain were arrangements made for social and financial benefit, rather than an expression of pure love. For Woolf, her marriage to Leonard was indeed a love match. But for Clarissa Dalloway, her marriage to Richard was her ticket to lifelong security and status. And whilst Clarissa prizes Richard for his dignity and stability, she constantly compares him to the passionate Peter Walsh. Yet Peter's own failed marriage and the ridicule he faces exposes how conservative British society punished those who lived by their emotions. Woolf also explores established gender roles through the theme of marriage and relationships. Clarissa's role as a wife is often dismissed as her being an ornamental accessory for an important man. Woolf strongly criticises how marriage offered social security to women but also trapped them in rigid expectations. Being past childbearing age, Clarissa laments her perceived uselessness and how her marriage has erased part of her identity. However, there are some hopeful examples of feminine agency. Lady Millicent Bruton is quite successful in influencing the ruling class and establishes a formidable legacy of her own. This acknowledges that independence and influence can be granted to a woman who marries well. Clarissa's daughter Elizabeth also enjoys the freedom of choosing a meaningful career without having to think of marriage. This was a promising sign of shifting values in post-war British society. Yet, despite this positive development, the reality of death and mortality was ever present in the post-war mass consciousness. The way Woolf explores death in the novel also reflects her experience with it at a young age. By the time she was 24, Woolf had lost her mother, father, brother and half-sister to separate illnesses. Each of these deaths were catastrophic for Woolf's mental health and led to a periodic desire for death. But Woolf was also known among friends for her extraordinary vitality and zest for life. Like Clarissa, she loved beautiful things and the bustle of London on a summer's day. Woolf captures her complex thoughts about life and death in Clarissa's own musings on the subject. Did it matter that she must inevitably cease completely? All this must go on without her. Did she resent it? Or did it not become consoling to believe that death ended absolutely? Clarissa hopes that death isn't the absolute end, but seems capable of accepting it if it is. But she would rather believe that our essence lives on like a mist in the ebb and flow of things. When Clarissa was young, her sister Sylvia was killed by a falling tree at Bourton. This parallels Woolf's own terrible loss of her mother at a young age. Through Clarissa, not only do we get a sense of Woolf's ardent love for life, but we also see her philosophical interest in death. At the climax of the novel, Septimus's suicide seems to reflect Woolf's attitude towards death. While death can be considered a tragedy, Woolf reimagines it as an act of rebellion, an escape from an excruciating life. When news of the suicide reaches Clarissa at her glamorous party, it is a painful reality check for her. However, after a moment's thought, Clarissa is able to find meaning in the young man's death. She is able to see it as more than just an anonymous tragedy. It shows her that life is precious and beautiful, and affirms her decision to host her party in the first place. Great work! Now you have a detailed understanding of how the historical context of Virginia Woolf shaped the ideas in Mrs Dalloway. In this lesson, we have looked at the way Woolf depicts British society, class and culture, the treatment of people with mental illness, dreams, memories, and the passage of time, marriage and relationships, and the reality of death and mortality in the post-war period. Linking these themes in Mrs Dalloway to their contextual influences will help you write amazing paragraphs. We hope you enjoyed this Schooling Online production. For more easy lessons, check out our other videos.